I'm Andrew Hall, and this is Dead Hand Radio. My guest for this episode is UFO researcher and MUFON board member Tom Whitmore. In this episode, Tom and I will be discussing MKULTRA and Mind Control. 2 weeks ago, I was joined by Remote Viewer Daz Smith for a conversation about Roswell. During that discussion, I alluded to the idea that the Roswell Event is one of the most effective cases of information management ever conducted. A process which enables those controlling the information to effectively control reality, or more specifically, the perception of reality. Also known as reality management, perception management, and in the former Soviet Union, it was called Reflexive Control Theory. It's worth mentioning here because I continue to find these terms in my research, and it's important to be aware of these patterns and make note of these things when they do show up. With that in mind, welcome back to Dead Hand Radio, Tom.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be here.
Well, thank you for being here, man. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
Sure.
So if you would just give a brief overview of how you got interested in UFOs and where your research on that topic has led you to up to this point so far. Just a real quick overview of that.
Well, I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and there was a lot of UFO activity reflected in the media. And back in those days, we actually had newspapers. So you had newspaper coverage. We had only three networks on the TV. And there was a pretty big special put on by CBS about the UFO problem. Donald Kehoe was on national TV on a program about UFOs. And I took an interest from there. I started reading Donald Kehoe books when I was around 12, 13 years old. But I didn't get more interested until the 1980s. And then in the 1980s, I was reading up quite a bit on the history of the Soviet Union, and I got interested in espionage and intelligence work. And then in the early 90s, I began to take an active interest in the UFO field and reading in the UFO subject. And when I got a look at the MJ-12 documents, I immediately felt that it must have something to do with espionage or intelligence work. So my long-term interest has been the history of the MJ-12 affair and the aspects of the MJ-12 question, which is ultimately connected with Roswell, one way or another. So I got interested in UFOs actively. I became a field investigator with MUFON and a state section director for a while, and I was invited on the board. And I've been on the MUFON board ever since about 1995. And currently I'm conducting my own research in the area of MJ-12, but I've expanded my topics to the point that I'm trying to dig deeper and go below the surface and learn more about how the government operates. For example, right now I'm working on a paper about the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, which is connected with the MJ-12 affair. And I'm studying various government directives and policies and documents. For example, I've been reading the National Security Act and the Atomic Energy Act and other directives and policies that affect what kind of intelligence work that domestic agencies can do and what the military agencies can do. So right now I'm right in the middle of that.
Well, we've had multiple conversations about your work and your research, multiple conversations, and a lot of it has focused on psychological operations, disinformation, and the various methods and practices that may or may not be implemented by the U.S. government to keep this information hidden from the public. the topic for today is not necessarily directly related, though it may be. In some instances, there may be a connection, but it is connected because it's a similar form, or there has been a similar history of the MKUltra project to these areas of disinformation and psychological operations. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. I was, in prepping for this program, I was looking at your blog to see if you've done any, deep dives and what you've kind of found out on MKUltra. I saw that you had read the book Shimmering Light, Lost in an
Yes.
MKUltra House of Anu by Walter Bosley. Could you give me a brief summary of that book? Because I didn't have a chance really to look at that and what that's about. And what did you think of the book?
The book outlines Walter Bosley's father's experiences that his father related to him, and his dad was being in the military, was ostensibly sent to an Air Force base to undergo either a training or a study, and it was diverted, according to Bosley. The flight was diverted to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And Bosley does, he mentions some things that his father told him about possibly being involved with an underground group. I mean, literally underneath the earth, like an alien group or something. And I think that it's possible that his dad was somewhat affected by his health situation at the time. He was aging, possibly dying. And it's an exploration by Walter Bosley into various peripheral topics that could be related to that. And he does discuss quite a bit of different subjects that are either directly or indirectly related to UFOs and mind control in the book. It's pretty much his personal take on how he thinks his dad's experiences could be related to some of the things that we are concerned with in the UFO field. That's my take on it.
The subtitle, A Story of Paperclip Nazis, Roswell UFOs, A Lost Race, and Perception Management, which is a term that, like I said, it continues to come up in my own research, this perception management. So your summary of the book, in a way, seems to he seems to be trying to tie these things: Roswell, perception management, which MKUltra could fall under the term perception management. Paperclip, which there is some connection to MKUltra. We'll get into that a little bit later. But what did you think of the story? Did it seem far-fetched, or did it seem like it was pretty grounded in reality?
I think that there wasn't really enough in his father's testimony, from my perspective, to go on to make much of what he said. Now, Walter Bosley and his relationship with his father, it has an entirely different meaning to him. And Bosley had a background, so he claims, and I think he was in the FBI, and then he became a special agent for AFOSI later. So he had a law enforcement and intelligence and counterintelligence background. So when his father related these experiences to him, I think it's very meaningful to him. But in looking at the actual assertions or allegations that his father made, I didn't really see enough there to really build a solid case on. That's just my personal perception of it.
Right. I mean, other than you can make some anecdotal connections between Wright-Patterson. If he was at Wright-Patterson, that's allegedly where the UFOs from Roswell went. And then the paperclip Nazis. We'll get into that a little bit further down, because we'll talk about some of the history of the MKUltra project and our program. But the idea of mind control goes back to the beginning of civilization, practically. I mean, it's been around for thousands of years. But the modern day application of mind control within the United States, and particularly by the government, is often referred to as MKUltra. Most people who hear the term MKUltra, if they know anything about it, associate it with mind control. This started out during the period of World War II. From my understanding, it started out during the period of World War II with the operation, or the Office of Strategic Services, and they were trying to find ways to extract information from enemy combatants. So that is really where the genesis of the MKUltra program started. In your own research and understanding of the program, is there any more that you could add to the genesis part of it?
Well, I think that in terms of state power and national security, I think the United States lost its virginity during World War II, so to speak. And if you look at what the Germans and the Nazis were doing in parallel to what Stalin was doing in the Soviet Union, I think that American planners and analysts must have been very alarmed when they were seeing the trends, the larger trends in these state actors affecting mass behavior. You had Hitler, who had this magnetic attraction to the German people. You had fanatical Nazis, and then the Germans invading Russia and doing the most horrific, inhuman things. While at the same time, you had Stalin and the NKVD, and which became the KGB, doing the same kinds of mental manipulations on individuals and groups. For example, the show trials during the 1930s. So there was this general trend of state power affecting both individuals, groups, and whole societies, manipulating and directing them to do frightening things. And then in World War II, we not only needed to get information from combatants, but by the 40s, I think some people were getting wise to the fact that Stalin had infected various parts of the US government with spies. The Soviets were extremely capable in spying. And, there was concern about that. So after World War II, we're directly getting into the Cold War and developing nuclear weapons. And Stalin had developed the atomic bomb on his side. So there was a great deal of concern about how are we going to deal with the Soviet Union, a country that was really very, very proficient at espionage. And, we got into this East-West game of spy versus spy. So I think there was a need to improve our techniques to get the information that we needed in this battle, in this conflict.
So it seems like what you're saying, once again, the U.S. was trailing behind the Soviet Union, which was the case in several instances throughout the Cold War. One of those being the space program. But the idea that the Soviets had a a really well established spying organization already, and the Germans also had that as well.
The Germans were pretty good, but I don't think they were as good as the Soviets were.
Oh, yeah. Well, the so 1947, the CIA was established, and they continued the study of the the mind control program, what the OSS had started, and the next kind of milestone, unless I'm missing something, you feel free to jump in if I'm missing something, but the next milestone in the progress of the mind control program in the US came in 1950 with the Korean War. And
Yes.
the American soldiers were subjected to mind control tactics by the Korean and the Red Chinese Army, and they were basically convinced to believe that they had participated in germ warfare, and they admitted to this on camera. And that was done through, well, there were several methods employed to get these soldiers to admit this stuff, but that really sent up the red flags with the CIA.
Yes.
And at that point, they decided to, well, the term Manchurian Candidate came out of that period, and the CIA decided that they needed their own Manchurian Candidate program to counteract or to combat that type of warfare.
Yeah, and there was a lot of concern about so-called brainwashing during the Korean War and after the Korean War. Exactly what you mentioned, Andrew. And I think the Koreans, the North Koreans, may have been employing an even more extreme version of what the Chinese had developed. That the communist Chinese had developed, and the communist Chinese had this technique of so-called self-criticism. They would put people in groups. They would, affect them in ways in group behavior that influenced them to change their ways of thinking. And it was a system of rewards and punishments. So when we saw these American soldiers saying things that we knew weren't true, and then some of them actually defecting and staying over either in Korea or China, I think this caused a great concern to American planners. Now, I have looked into this a little bit, and there were, I don't know how many blacks, but there were maybe a couple of African Americans that stayed over in China after the war because they felt like they couldn't be any worse off than they were in the United States. And during the 40s, the United States was still a very, very racist country in terms of how it treated African Americans. So that accounted for maybe a couple of the instances of defections, but it seemed incomprehensible to us that Americans would defect and stay over in Korea or in China.
Yeah, that is a good point, because the living conditions were not better in China or Korea at that time. So the political system that those countries had was communist. So they were no better off there. But if they were convinced to believe that they were better off, then that would be that would seem to justify why those people would leave, and decide to stay behind.
Yeah.
So the program that was started, the first name that the program went under was Project Bluebird, and then it was later named in 1952. It was named Artichoke. Where they get these names, it doesn't make any sense to me. It's like they pick a name out of a hat or something, because they don't have any association with mind control or anything like that until you get to MKUltra. The MK being, the either Manchurian Candidate or mind control. I'm not sure which that MK is supposed to represent. But there were several iterations of the MK program, and I didn't even find all the names that it went under, but it went under a bunch of different names. There was a chemist who headed up that program named Sidney Gottlieb.
Yes.
This dude is, I don't know, how this guy got into such a high-ranking position in the U.S. government, but he didn't seem to have a lot of ethics. As for a scientist, this guy just had one goal in mind, and that was to, I guess, serve his country and find ways of defeating the enemy at all costs, even if it meant experimentations on our own citizens.
Yeah, and you have to keep in mind too. Now, it's apparent that the CIA was engaging in all kinds of unethical activities in their experimentation and their investigations in this. But at the same time, I think we should remember that the Soviets, for example, I think they had a whole department within the KGB that specialized in poisons and how to poison people. So, there was this general trend toward better spying through chemistry, one way or another. And I think they were looking at a variety of things that might help them. The main thing seemed to be the truth serum, the sodium pentothal or the sodium amytal or other compounds that could get a person that's being interrogated to tell the truth. And in some ways that seems unethical and it seems nefarious, but in other ways it seems justifiable. For example, what if you suspected that an atomic attack was imminent, and you had a person on hand that might be able to tell you, what the situation really is, and so you're in a very desperate, high risk, high crisis situation where you need information, you need correct information. So at the time in the 1950s, we were developing extensive systems to deliver atomic weapons, and so were the Soviets. So I think these could have been some of the justifications for doing some things that they were doing.
Although in hindsight, it's easy to see that those the methods that they were using to develop this type of a program were, well, first of all, they were unreliable. Those drugs that they were using were, there's not enough evidence to support that they were ever able to extract any reliable information. There were other techniques that were employed, or that were tested under Gottlieb's leadership, which included drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and even forms of torture. And I think now, as much time as we've had to study these types of information extraction, it's pretty much well known that most of those methods don't really work to recover accurate information. Now, there are some that may have credibility.
You're probably right there, Andrew, but I don't know if we really know, because so much of this stuff is done in secret.
And that brings up a great point. A lot of the records that were kept for these experiments were destroyed. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on because we're jumping ahead. But how do we know what the findings were of these experiments when they essentially deleted the data?
And if they have something that really works, they're not going to want our adversaries to know that, because they might be able to develop a countermeasure
Yeah,
or
that's true.
countermeasures.
Yeah, that is a good point. So the uses of mind control, and there may be more than this, but from what I uncovered, there's three main areas that they can use mind control, or that they were experimenting on to use it. Extraction of information, which we talked about, erasing memories, which is really interesting and very strange, and even more nefarious, implanting false memories, which is where the Korean U.S. soldiers were subjected to. I think is the implanting of false memories.
Yeah, and we on the rumor level, and this has been mentioned on Coast to Coast radio, and I don't remember who the author was that was talking about it, but there was this rumor going around that there's a technique of torturing children, and which causes the personality to become fragmented. You create multiple personalities, and then hypnotically suggestions are implanted in the mind, that are they're activated later. Is that what you're talking about?
The implanting of false memories.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, there's several methods of getting the false memories into the subject, but I think what you're talking about is let me see if I can find this term. I think it's called fragmenting, where they basically, through whatever it is, torture, drugs, hypnosis, sleep therapy, which is we're jumping a little bit ahead to I think the 1950s, where in Canada they did some experimentations where they used sleep therapy, depatterning. That's the term I was looking for, where they fragment the person's personality, and then through sleep therapy, where they keep them asleep for long periods of time, and they use a method of like they call it psychic driving, where they use recordings. They play the recordings over and over and over. Basically, you got a blank slate from depatterning. So you got this mind that's empty, and then you reprogram it with these recordings. That's a method that was implemented over a period of time by this dude, Cameron.
The Canadian.
In Montreal. Ewan Cameron, it was his name. But he used electroshock therapy and then that sleep therapy to get basically the conscious mind erased.
That's a very crude theory.
Yeah, absolutely.
That, I think, his whole approach, I mean, he messed up at least one person really badly, right, if not more, and it didn't really work anyway.
Yeah,
from what I could tell.
So the other thing you're talking about, where they're doing that on the children, I only know a little bit about that, and I think it is, there's not a lot of documentation to back up the claims that it was a real program, but we'll get into that, towards the end, that one. But there was, that gets into creating Manchurian Candidate type of split personality type things. But I think it's, it's broken down into the three main topics of extraction of information, erasing the memories so that you could carry out an operation, and then it's wiped out from your memory completely, so you can never reveal the information that you retrieved or whatever you did during that operation. And then the implanting of false memories.
Right. But the whole, I think the theory of compartmentation of information where you're only told what you need to know to do your job. I think that there's this notion that no one can really withstand torture in the longer run, and so you can't relay information that you don't have, and this is a lot of, I think, the notion of using compartmentation of
Right.
information.
That's a good point. So that's a way to counteract this type of information extraction. If you don't have the information, they could torture you all they want to, and you're never going to reveal anything. Although you may give them false information just to stop the torture from happening. So as I said, the program went through several iterations of naming. In the 70s, it was called MK Search for a little while. And if anybody's interested, I want to give the Black Vault a plug here, because he's got thousands of records on that that were released through FOIA process and declassified on the mind control program. And one thing that I found interesting was, aside from the documentation and the data that was destroyed during the purge in the 70s, there are, of the declassified remaining pages, there's still thousands of pages that are missing. So even John Greenwald hasn't been able to get the whole, I think there was supposedly 20,000 pages of documentation that survived the purge. Even Greenwald hasn't been able to get all those records because they're just missing, or allegedly missing.
Yeah, and that's too bad, but that's the way it is.
It's frustrating because, like you said, without the information, we don't really know what they developed or what they learned from those experiments. And at the same time, if they let that information out to the public, then our enemies, or our adversaries, I guess is more politically correct term, our adversaries would learn what we know and be able to potentially counteract our methods.
Sure. It's a nasty business.
One of the drugs that was used extensively in the mind control program was LSD. LSD was found. Now, I had originally thought that the CIA developed LSD. They did not develop it. It was created by a chemist in Switzerland.
Albert Hoffman in Switzerland.
Herbert Hoffman.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, you're right. His name is Hoffman, in the 40s. So I assume that happened during World War II, when LSD was, because I don't have an exact date when it was developed, but it was developed.
I think it may have been in the 30s.
Oh, okay.
But I'd have to check. But it was, it was around that time, 30s or 40s.
And the CIA apparently thought that this drug was so dangerous that they didn't want the Soviet Union to get any of it, so they bought up the entire world supply of it to have control of that drug, which they later put to good use in their mind control program, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Apparently, though, the LSD creates a psychotic dissociation in the subject, making them question reality itself. I don't know. I've never used LSD. I've seen people that have had bad trips on LSD where they freak out completely, and then other people use it as oh man, what's the term? Like a social drug. They use it just to get high, and then have a really wild trip, I guess. That's how it's used now. But it was believed at that time that while in that state, that the subject would be more susceptible to revealing information, or making a confession to something that they did. But there was really no evidence to support that that's what they were able to get from administering this to people.
Well, there was at the time, in the 40s and 50s, very little was known about LSD.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the CIA was probably searching for chemicals that might be helpful and, maybe serving as a truth serum or somehow affecting who is being interrogated in such a way that, they get more information that they need. And I think they experimented with it and probably found that it wasn't useful in that respect. But I think there's also the possibility that the U.S. Military and government and our adversaries were looking at chemical agents that could be used on the battlefield. So, there's the possibility if you can spray the enemy with LSD and they all sit down and they're picking flowers and putting flowers in guns, instead of fighting, maybe something like that. And I think there was some, maybe some interest in that possibility. For all we know, they have it in their chemical arsenal to this day.
Who's they? Are you talking about
the United
U.S.
States
government? Yeah. Yeah, that would be an interesting way to fight a battle. I mean, you drop LSD on the troops and they get high and don't want to fight anymore.
The problem with chemical agents like that is a distribution of it in such a way that it's effective. You spray an area and then maybe it blows away and all that kind of thing. So you have problems with that. But if you can effectively get it to your enemy, then, it obviously will have an effect. Now, from what I know about LSD, it takes a while for it to take effect. It's not immediate, but, maybe it could be used in a situation like that.
So one of the things that kind of surprised me in my research on this topic was that we've talked about the CIA running these programs or doing these experiments, but they didn't actually do it themselves. They oversee the program and they fund private or public institutions to conduct these studies. We call them studies. Experiments is just as good of a term to use because they were doing human experiments on with these. But some of the institutions that I found that were doing these studies was MIT, Cornell University, Stanford, Princeton, and Johns Hopkins. And there's probably more. Those are just the few that I found.
Are you talking about the general MKUltra or experimentation with LSD?
All of the above. The
Okay.
entire program, yeah.
Yeah.
Now the more extreme stuff, what we were talking about with the electroshock therapy and the depatterning that was done by you and Cameron, that was only done up in the Ravens Craig in Quebec, Montreal. But he's an interesting character. So interesting in that he's the connection to the Nazi mind control program, because he was involved with the interrogation of those scientists during the Nuremberg trials. That's Ewan Cameron. He was there at the Nuremberg trials. He was involved in interrogating those Nazi, I guess you would call them death camp scientists that were experimenting on the prisoners. Those
Excuse me.
The methods, some of the methods that he actually employed were learned during those interrogations at the Nuremberg trials. I thought that was pretty interesting, but also, I can't believe that they would allow somebody to do the same experiments that were being done on prisoners in the death camps during World War II. some of those methods were sleep therapy, which we talked about. One patient was kept asleep for 65 days straight. That's how extreme the experimentation was. Depatterning, which is where they basically wipe away the conscious mind, and then psychic driving is where they reprogram the blank slate to think and behave. And there was one, I think the person you were talking about is this mother who didn't even recognize her children, after this whole therapy. So he was never brought to justice, as far as I know. He was never convicted of anything. I think there were 9 families that were awarded a monetary, reward because of their, being subjected to these experiments in the Canadian trials, or Canadian experiments, I should say.
Uh-huh.
So,
No, it was a terrible thing, and it's like a Dr. Frankenstein
yeah, exactly.
messing around, like a mad scientist messing around, and some of these mad scientist types, in Nazi Germany, it's really horrific.
Yeah. Now the CIA wasn't directly involved in that, although they were funding it, and Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of the CIA program, was involved and pretty much knew what was going on over at that facility. So for the CIA to try to deny knowledge of this, it's I don't think that they could, although the documentation is really sketchy.
It's their modus operandi.
Exactly. Yeah.
Deny.
Right. The next milestone that I want to talk about, and you probably, hopefully, quite a bit about this one, is Frank Olson. In 1953, he was the biochemist who was part of the MKUltra program. He was given a dose of LSD along with other members of the program, but he had a particularly bad trip from that experience, and it was alleged that he was going to blow the whistle, and expose the program for what it really was. Because of he started to kind of spiral down after that experience. So he was taken to New York to a hotel, which doesn't really make any sense, but supposedly he was there to meet with a psychiatrist that was going to help him. I don't know the name of that psychiatrist. I didn't get that far. But while he was there, he allegedly jumped out the window of the 12th story hotel room. There are a lot of suspicious circumstances around that suicide or his death. And the real tragedy of that is that the truth of his death was kept hidden from his family until 1976, when they received a payment from the U.S. government and acknowledgement that his death was a result of that LSD incident.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've heard that LSD can sometimes cause people to feel like they can fly, and they'll jump out of a window thinking they can fly. That may have been what happened with Art Linkletter's daughter. Art Linkletter was a well-known media personality in the 50s through the 70s, and his daughter tragically died on an LSD trip. She had jumped out a window.
Frank Olson wasn't on LSD at the time of his death. It happened several days or several weeks later, and it was there's a whole Netflix miniseries about this. It's called Wormwood, and I watched it a couple years ago. It's a really good program. I don't know how accurate it is, because they do push the idea that he was murdered by the CIA versus committed suicide. But either way it stacks up, it was a tragic death, an unnecessary death. The guy should have, received help when he was basically taken to a hotel room for whatever reason, a debriefing or, who knows what, to be threatened, to keep silent. I don't know. Why would they take him to a hotel if they're trying to get him a treatment?
I was under the impression he was on LSD, but I could
Not
have
at
that
that time.
wrong.
Although, if he was
But
given,
why would his family get a payment from the government if the government wasn't doing something wrong there?
because they admitted that he was given LSD against his knowledge or consent at that one meeting, which was a couple of weeks before he died.
Oh, okay.
And then as a result of that, he went into a really deep depression and basically never recovered. So if he did kill himself at that hotel, it was a direct result of that LSD experience that he had. And the government admitted that much. They did not admit to killing him, but they admitted that it was his death was associated with that LSD experience that he had.
Yeah. Well, we'll never really know.
But the payout they got was a fraction of what they should have gotten. Apparently, during the hearings for this amount that was going to be awarded to the family, there was one congressman in the group that argued against the amount that they were talking about, which was in the millions. It turns out that they were awarded a $500,000 payout for his death, which was, a mere fraction of what they had talked about getting and what was recommended by several other Congress members.
Yeah.
As a result of that, that's when all those documents and all that data was purged, because they didn't want to get caught red-handed with all this information about these nefarious programs that they had been running for so many years.
Yes. And we can only guess what that information is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's no way. It'll never come out. And the only reason it did come out, from what I understand, is that Gottlieb had, or it wasn't Gottlieb at the time, there was another dude in control or in overseeing it. He had some financial records that he had forgotten about, and those records eventually came out later. Luckily, those weren't destroyed, but that's all we've got. And out of that 20,000, several thousand of those pages are still missing. So some this is in the realm of speculation now, because these are possible Manchurian candidates. These are people that may have been subjected to a mind control program, carried out an operation, and then don't actually remember doing it. But a couple of those people are Patty Hearst. Are you familiar with her case?
Uh-huh. Yes, very much so.
Yeah, and her behavior was so odd, and what she was subjected to, although it was more than likely not a U.S. government operation. I don't even know who that group was. It was some kind of antisocial group that kidnapped her, but they kept her in a closet for 45 days, tortured her, and but then she got the syndrome where she feels sympathetic towards her captors.
Stockholm syndrome,
right? And then she actually helped them to rob a bank. Was she a Manchurian candidate? Who's to say? Not a government sanctioned Manchurian candidate, but she may be. Lee Harvey,
and it's kind of similar to the Korean prisoners in that you capture somebody and you start giving them the other side of the story. For example, the Korean prisoners might have been told, "Hey, why is your government over here fighting us? We haven't done anything to your country." Has it occurred to you that the United States is an extremely powerful imperialist country pushing other small peoples around? And maybe they were getting to them, getting to their attitudes. And then they start to look at it from the other way. Maybe that happened with Patty Hearst. They captured her and they started telling her, has it ever occurred to you that your family is extremely wealthy and that they've gotten it out of the hide of the poor people? And don't you think your family should owe something to the poor people of California and the United States, and blah, blah, blah. I don't know what they told her or could have told her, but maybe it was something along those lines. Yeah. And she started to buy into it.
Well, on top of that, she was being tortured, sleep deprivation, isolated. I think they were raping her. There was accusations of her being raped several times. So there was physical trauma that was also, done. And between that and then the suggestive ideas that they were putting in her head, yeah, that sounds exactly what could have happened.
Well, and part of it could have been, at least unconsciously, a visceral fear that they were going to kill her if she didn't do what they wanted her to do.
Yeah.
So maybe psychologically, she kind of flipped, and started seeing things from their point of view and wanting to help them. And then as soon as she was free, she probably didn't feel that way anymore. I don't think she feels that way today. I doubt it.
I didn't even touch on this, but I want to get through the Manchurian candidates real quick, and then we'll go into some of the other stuff and an idea that just came up. I'm going to give myself a note to make sure I don't forget. So Lee Harvey Oswald, Kennedy's assassin, was he a Manchurian candidate? He does show some signs of possibly being a Manchurian candidate. The idea that he was calling himself a patsy, I'm a patsy, that his behavior after the assassination, going to a movie theater and just hanging out there, those don't seem like they would line up with somebody who just murdered the U.S. president. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've looked at his behavior after the shooting. I think that he probably did shoot at President Kennedy at a minimum. But Oswald may have been dumber than we want to think, because if you were going to shoot the President of the United States in broad daylight, don't you think you would have an escape plan?
Unless he was a Manchurian candidate, and now, that operation was.
So he leaves the book depository and he goes back to his apartment to get his gun.
Mm-hmm.
Now that indicates either one of two things. He was so dumb that he didn't have an escape plan, or two, he was supposed to make a connection there and they didn't show up. Okay. And then he went back to his apartment to get his gun. Okay. Now, and that could explain why he said that he was a patsy, because there was supposed to be a rendezvous, which didn't, in other words, he was double crossed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why he went back to get his gun. Or he was so dumb that he was willing to shoot the president and not even have an escape plan.
I don't know. I haven't looked into the case all that much. I know that Oliver Stone did a really good movie on it. And he lays out a pretty compelling case that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the only shooter. And I think in that movie, he wasn't even the trigger man in that movie. JFK, did you see that movie?
Yeah, I've seen it, and it's all fascinating stuff, and I've read, a little bit about this, but the problem is it's all circumstantial.
Right.
And there's no chain of custody. If Oswald was a hired assassin somehow, say by the CIA, then someone had to be his controller. And then that controller was associated with either a group or that controller was reporting to a higher authority. And there's no chain of custody has ever been established in terms of the conspiracy. There are these vague but very interesting associations being made, between this person and that person, and the people in Louisiana, but if there's another shooter, who was it? If there were one, we need an identification of an actual person that was the other shooter. And that has never been established. So I'm not saying it wasn't a conspiracy, but a clear chain of custody has never been established. Now, the thing that I've heard that makes the most sense to me has been articulated by Danny Sheehan, who is now working with Luis Elizondo. But Sheehan said that Nixon, during the Nixon administration, during the Eisenhower administration, that they had made a request of Howard Hughes to arrange Kennedy's death, and that Howard Hughes went to his employee, Mr. Mayhew, who's a former FBI agent. Mayhew went to the Chicago mob, and I'm getting older and having trouble remember people's names, but I think Sam Giancana. And Sam Giancana said that he would do the job, but that he had to have the permission of Mr. Trafficante in Florida, because that was his territory. Okay. And that Trafficante supposedly hired one or more assassins from this Cuban group that was operating in these Cubans that were operating in these insurrection camps that they had in the South, in Louisiana and Florida. But that's as far as it goes. But that made a lot of sense to me in terms of a chain of custody. But it doesn't go all the way to the actual shooting.
Do you have a theory on that? On the, that's getting a little bit off the topic, but since we're on that topic, it's always interesting to hear what people's theories are. Was Oswald the lone shooter, or did he shoot Kennedy at all?
I think that he shot at him. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, whether he actually fired the kill shot, I don't know, because there is all this controversy about there's an entry wound in Kennedy's neck that the doctors say was an entry wound, not an exit wound, which implies it came from the front. So maybe there was at least one other shooter involved. But I just don't. It's another one of those things that are left hanging. We don't really know. I don't know if we'll ever know. And there have been highly competent investigators that finally have managed to actually get laws passed that they would actually release all the information that was available. And they had it down to a date. I think it was 2018 or 2020 or sometime, and they still didn't release all the information. Yeah. So they
extended it until 2030 or something, right?
Well, they're just kicking the can down the road.
Yeah. I just want to put this out there. Star Alley Mistral says lots of remote viewers have independently concluded that Oswald did not do it alone. Do you think that our government, CIA, and other agencies will ever allow people alive now knowing about the truth?
No, I don't.
Probably not.
Not if there's any truth to be told that's of interest.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, Star, and thanks for your comment. So, Sirhan, do you think he was a potential Manchurian candidate? The Robert Kennedy assassin.
It almost seems that it's more likely that he was more of a Manchurian candidate type. And that made no sense to me and we get into this lone nut pattern of assassination. It's like, how many lone nuts, are there going to be out there? You kind of start to wonder, but I haven't really gotten into that much. It doesn't really interest me personally that much as a tragic thing. I'm sorry it happened. But it seems like you could go into almost any controversial event and develop a conspiracy theory out of it. It happens all the time.
Sirhan again is his behavior before and after the event took place is just really strange. It doesn't seem, and maybe there is a pattern. Maybe the pattern is after they kill a world leader that they go insane, or temporary insanity and forget what they had done. So, but Sirhan still to this day doesn't remember, or claims he doesn't remember actually having pulled that trigger. Even though there were witnesses that said he was the shooter, it's really not disputed that he did the shooting. But in this instance, he doesn't apparently remember doing the shooting. And then there's this idea about a woman in a flower dress, and supposedly she said something to him before he went, and possibly gave him a trigger word or something that triggered him to go do that. It's just an interesting case. I don't know enough about it to make a statement either way. I just think it's an interesting case, and his behavior around that event is really strange, really bizarre behavior. And then one more. I don't know a lot about this case, but it's a lot more recent. Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bombing, where he blew up a government building. I think it was was it an IRS building?
Well, it was a government building. I think they had several different government offices in there.
So could he have potentially been a Manchurian candidate? I don't really know. But it's, when you start thinking about instances where there is supposedly, like you said, a lone gunman or, an individual that carries out an act like this. And another guy that may have been, well, I don't want to go too, I don't want to get too much into this, but Theodore Kaczynski.
Yeah.
Whether or not he was a Manchurian candidate, I don't know, but he was subjected to some unusual, could be considered mind control experiments before he became the Unabomber.
Yeah, that was a long time before. It was when he was in college at Harvard,
right.
And he was subjected to this psychological study, and it was, from what I could tell of it, it was an exercise in cognitive dissonance. Here's this young man. He's a brilliant kid with a 160 IQ. He's developing some pretty progressive social theories, and then they put him in a room and tell him that he's full of it, that he doesn't know what he's talking about, that he's wrong, that his logic is flawed. And I think, it created, I think, a scenario of cognitive dissonance for him. And maybe that confused him. He claims that it didn't affect the course of his life. But who knows? Maybe it did.
Yeah. So there are several other forms, what we talked about so far, of mind control, but there's several other forms of mind control that are a lot more subtle, that don't involve the torture or drugs. And this is just a partial list. There's probably a lot more, but propaganda and the media, that is undoubtedly, you could argue that it's not, but I would argue that propaganda and media are forms of mind control. Do you have anything to add to that? I don't want to really present a case that proves my theory that these are mind control, but do you have anything to add to that?
It seems human nature that humans are vulnerable to leadership, and you have society organized in such a way that certain institutions are authorities: the government, the scientific community, the media. And so you have the media outlets telling you what is the truth, so to speak. And through advertising, you have the entertainment media telling you what you should care about, what clothes to wear, what cars to buy, what furniture, et cetera, et cetera. So even though it's not a form of mind control, it's a form of influence, because people are acting on what's being put in front of them. The powers that be, so to speak, are putting information in front of the public, and then the public acts according to that. It's like, even myself, I mean, I have to blame myself. I go on YouTube looking for something to watch, and I'm operating out of what they're putting in front of me. Those are my choices.
Mhm.
So it takes work, and it takes discipline to go beyond that and say, no, I'm going to think for myself. I'm going to decide what to do on my own, rather than let the media tell me what to do, or let the news organizations tell me what to think. Now, I read back in the 70s, I read a book called Economics and the Public Purpose by John Kenneth Galbraith, who is admittedly a liberal economist. But he made the point that the advertising industry, coupled with the corporations that are selling goods and services, that it's so sophisticated that they're actually manipulating the public into doing what they want them to do. And he said, if you watch primetime TV, these primetime TV shows that go on and on year after year, he said, watch out, because you're being manipulated. And after I read that, I stopped watching primetime TV, to the point to where I was really out of touch with the mainstream, by the 80s, because I just wasn't following the same thing that the public was following. I think we have to realize that, okay, the media puts information out there for us to absorb, but we need to think for ourselves. We need to think critically and examine what's being put in front of us, and try to make up our own minds about what we should do and think, what is in our interests as individuals and as groups and society, and not necessarily what the powers that be are putting in front of us.
So I added a side note to other forms of mind control, is what I titled this list. I added a note, or a side note, to that: perception management. So these, and I think perception management is a form of mind control. That's just my thinking. I'm connecting the dots there. That those dots may not be connectable, but I think that those two things go hand in glove. Psychological operations. Would you consider that mind control?
I wouldn't consider it mind control, but I'd just like to comment on the evolution of the terms, because I think today psychological warfare sounds a little too brutal.
Yeah.
To the public's mind, and they used that term back in the 40s and 50s, and then we got into perception management. Susan Goff of the Pentagon, the public spokesman for the Pentagon, wrote a paper about about psychological warfare, but they were referring to it as strategic influence, and I actually referenced that in one of the papers that I posted on my blog. Now I can tell you now, if you read the literature from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and from the Pentagon today, they're calling it information operations, which sounds even more opaque. And it doesn't sound nearly as nefarious as psychological warfare. But
so what is it? Information operations?
Yes, IO.
Oh wow, yeah.
Yeah, and I can quote chapter and verse on that, if I had to look it up.
Wow.
But that I think includes, Andrew, it includes psychological warfare, psychological operations, information management, like, cyber warfare. I think when cyber warfare became an issue, that's why they changed the term to be even more general into information operations.
Mm-hmm. Harassment and intimidation. This would be from like a government entity, like a type of bullying or intimidation to get people to keep quiet about a certain topic, or to not do a certain thing. Don't do this, or you're going to suffer the consequences. Is that in any way a form of mind control?
I wouldn't term it mind control. Mind control seems to be more of, from my point of view, it seems to be more on an individual basis. You have a spy and you're trying to find out information. You give that person a drug, hoping that they'll spill the beans, or you put them in a cell and you don't give them food for 3 days and play loud music and, all this kind of thing. And finally they break down and tell you the truth. There was a line from a spy movie in which the person that was being tortured, they asked him, how did they get the information out of you? And he said, they just wear you down over the time until you finally run out of stories. You just run out of what to say. So, I think mind control is more of an individual effort, but in broader terms, there is strategic influence. There's perception management. There are information operations. And I think internally, domestically, it's accomplished more through just the general matrix of the so-called establishment, the media, the government, the government. It's not that they have a specific program to affect our thinking, other than, with broad social issues, like, for example, with COVID, they want people to get vaccinated, and like that. But you have institutions like I said, the media, the scientific community, academia, people that are considered authorities in society. And we have a mix of institutions in such a way that we have a general pattern of information and behavior in the United States. But in terms of applying psychological warfare, that's supposed to be done in foreign countries against our adversaries. And that's where the military and the CIA and these government agencies come into play in coming up with programs to affect our adversaries. And you're trying to get them to do what you want them to do, and to not do what you don't want them to do.
Well, and the last two are pretty disparate from each other, but voice to skull, which is possibly a technology that exists where ideas can be broadcast into a person's mind through using technology. I don't know if that's a real thing or not. I've only heard like rumors about it, but is that if that's a real thing, that it's kind of hard to deny that that's not a form of mind control.
Well, it's definitely, if it occurs, it's definitely a form of harassment.
Right.
And, some people have come out and made allegations that, that's going on. I don't know how I can go any further than that. Some people have claimed they think that someone is sitting, I guess, in a van on the street corner with pointing something at them and, making them hear voices. Maybe there's something to that.
Man, we could go down another rabbit hole right now with the Son of Sam situation, but we'll leave that one for another time, because he was hearing voices allegedly, but there's a good series. I think it's on Netflix also. The Sons of Sam.
Yeah.
That was a pretty good, interesting series. So there's two more, I guess. Scientology. I think that they've been accused of using mind control in their programs. Is there evidence to support those claims other than testimony, witness testimony?
I think you get into the general subject of cults and the dynamics that occur in cults. And cults, the more negative type cults, engage in a form of social control. They set up the world in such a way that you're supposed to stay within the group, and it's a kind of us against them mentality. We persons within the cult, we know the truth, and there's the outside world that either doesn't understand what we understand, or they're trying to come after us. So, it becomes this us against them, and you get into the group dynamics of enforcing behavior, enforcing conformity within the group, and in its most extreme forms, I think you can term it as mind control. But it's in the cult context, I think it's a more accentuated form of group dynamics, in which you're trying to get people within a group and stay within a group and conform to the group's ethos. I'm sorry. And Scientology seems like it definitely gets bad press. I'm not in there. I've never done it. I have no idea. But there are other groups too that and I may offend some people this way, but certain evangelical Christian groups have some of the similar dynamics of these kind of group dynamics in cults, and that can be destructive. Now, the fact that there's a so-called techniques of deprogramming of people out of cults, that implies that there's a form of mind control going on within some of these groups. You have to deprogram them from the set of beliefs and attitudes and behaviors that they had adopted within this group.
Good point. And the final one that came up as we were talking is the Manson family, Charles Manson. I think that it's his ability to convince people to go murder complete strangers. There is, without a doubt, mind control involved in that whole situation. He was manipulating those people using drugs, intimidation, probably other methods that we've talked about already, and told them to go do something, carry out his orders, and they executed his orders without question.
Well, I think they were so drugged up that they realized what they were doing, but they didn't realize they were influenced to the point that their perception of right and wrong was distorted, really, to an extreme level. But I think that drugs had a lot to do with that.
How do you think Manson figured out how to do that? He just is he an anomaly as a human being? Is he one person? And there have been other people like him, but to be able to recruit and then manipulate and program people to do your bidding like that without any training, that's a really weird kind of.
I have this feeling, Andrew, that people are so hungry for leadership. They're so starving for leadership that if you show any leadership capabilities at all, you can be propounding the most ridiculous stuff, the stupidest stuff you can imagine, and some people will follow it. Okay. I think it's part of human nature.
Well, you also have to have that God complex. You have to think that you are some kind of prophet or divine person, right? Imbued with divine power somehow. You've got to have that mindset to think that you are deserving of other people's adoration or worship.
Yeah, I mean, if you believe it in yourself and you have the self-confidence, you really believe it, then some people are gonna fall into line along that. And I think that as humans we're left with three unanswered questions: where did we come from? Why are we here? And what happens to us after we die? And I think that leaves with people with a searching complex. They're searching for answers. And if someone comes along that'll lead them, and there's almost kind of a background motivation of laziness. If somebody else tells you what the truth is, you don't have to figure it out for yourself. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think that human nature has a lot to do with it. And there are leaders and there are followers. And some leaders are good and constructive, and some leaders are negative and destructive.
I don't feel like I'm either one of those, though. I don't feel like I'm a follower, but I don't feel like I'm a leader either. I feel like I'm just a person with a drive of curiosity to find answers. And I do my own thing, and I operate within the bounds of right and wrong. I know right from wrong. But for me personally, to be a leader or to be a follower, that doesn't seem to fit in my personality.
Well, I'm not saying that everyone is either a leader or a follower.
Okay.
But all of us at some times fall into one of those categories, depending on the circumstances.
I mean, I was in the military, so I was definitely a follower in that situation.
Yeah.
And then I was a boss. I mean, I owned my own business and I had employees, so I was a leader in that situation. However, at this point in my life, I don't fit into either of those categories, unless you consider I'm the father of my children, the grandfather to my grandson. In those situations, I'm more of like a teacher, though.
Yeah.
So I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I really don't want to get into this next part because it gets really dark. I mean, the idea of mind control gets into some really deep, dark places, and it's used for really nefarious purposes. What we talked about, state-sanctioned mind control, they did some bad things with it, but it was for a greater good, and that's how they justified doing it, like you said. But in other instances, it's been used for really, really dark, nefarious things. I don't want to get into that. So we'll just leave it at that. But parting thoughts, final thoughts on what we talked about?
There is one thing that my thinking has changed a little bit on, and that is the hippies in San Francisco during the 60s. Some notions have been promulgated that the CIA was involved in somehow affecting the distribution of LSD as a social experiment. And I'm almost inclined these days to think that there may be a little something to that. If if the CIA wasn't directly affecting the distribution of LSD into a social group, I think certain people were watching that closely. The development of the hippie movement in the 60s, because it did LSD under wide distribution like that, it did affect people's behavior. A lot of the hippies moved to the country. They moved to the countryside. It affected their attitudes about themselves and the world, and it changed their behavior. And I mentioned earlier about, using LSD on the battlefield and this kind of thing. So I think it's possible that the CIA or maybe certain other government planners were taking a close look at what was going on with that.
That's really interesting. Is that a theory that you have, or do you have anything that leads you to that conclusion?
I don't have a specific reference, but I think, in our general line of topics, Andrew, we run into a lot of conspiracy theories.
Right.
And I think theory was floated that the CIA was somehow connected with this LSD phenomenon in California. And I think at the time that I first heard that, I kind of poo-pooed it, but now I'm starting to think that maybe certain authorities were taking a close look at that.
And also, if you couple that with what I said about in the 50s, when the CIA found out that there was this organization that was developing LSD, they bought the entire world's supply of LSD. They had this supply. So what did they do with it? There's no documentation, no chain of custody to determine what they did with it. They most likely didn't throw it in the garbage can or hand it out to hippies, but there's no way to prove it didn't happen, right?
Yeah.
And
it wasn't just LSD. They were probably looking at psilocybin and mescaline and all these other, psychoactive substances.
There are many instances where social experiments like that have been conducted on the population, on the public, by the government. So it would not surprise me. I wouldn't put it past them to have done something like that. I was just wondering if you had if you had come across anything in your research to say that actually did happen.
No, but I'm just saying it's something that my attitude has changed a little bit on that.
Cool.
And drugs have been involved. I mean, in World War II, they gave speed to pilots, so that they could perform their missions. I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that Hitler was on long-term was on amphetamines, and this affected his mental state and his behavior. So, drugs come into play in some of the things in history.
Yeah, I even saw a documentary that said that was talking about the Nazi soldiers were using methamphetamines to enhance their fighting abilities.
Yeah.
So I posted the link to the Black Vault up there with their MKULTRA archives. John Greenwald has a ton of archives, government documents, because I saw a question there by Star a little while ago. She said, can you refer to which of the currently declassified documents you're referring to? Those are the documents that we were talking about as far as the MKUltra documents. Just going to go through real quick some of these other comments. In my hippie days living in North Hollywood commune in the hills, although there were some doing LSD, no one was jumping out of windows, violent, or any type of nefarious activities. That's true, Star, and not everybody reacts to LSD in the same way. And especially if you know that you're taking it, you're going to have a different reaction, I think, than to if you are given a dose against your knowledge without your consent. And then there are also videos of people, I think they're soldiers, knowingly given LSD, where their trip turns really bad really quick. It goes from just a little bit of a disorientation to feeling of euphoria to outright almost psychosis, where they have a complete break from reality. There are plenty of documented instances where that's the outcome. So it's not good for everybody, but in some cases, I think in lower doses, and where people have the ability or the opportunity to build up to it, I think that some people can use it and have a wonderful experience with it, but I don't think that's true for everybody. Carl Vibe says people can get into situations and circumstances and sign their life away into a maze of pressure and threats or debts that shape all their conditions. And that's true. That goes along with what we were talking about with the media influencing what decisions people make financially. You go to Times Square in New York and expect to experience some wonder of the world. Instead, it's nothing but digital advertising and banner ads in your face. Again, the media, it's just you can't get away from it. And anywhere you go now, it's in your hand, right? It's in your pocket 24/7. And shoot, the algorithms in the search engines are so advanced. Like what you were talking about. When was that book written that you read about the manipulation of the media, or that the advertising and the
I read it in the 70s. I think it may have come out earlier, but I read it around 1975, 77, sometime there.
If it was perfected back then, it's only gotten more effective and more proficient since then, right? You would think.
Well, I was on another show last night, and I made this point, but we're essentially addicted to technology now.
Yeah.
If you're not, I mean, I've got an iPhone, an iPad, and an iMac, and I'm on iMusic, and I use YouTube constantly. I research on the internet. I read books online. And you essentially can't be in the mainstream unless you're addicted to this technology. Yeah. They've got us by the neck, and a lot of it's good. I mean, it's great in many ways. It's a wonderful thing, but these internet companies, Google and Apple and all, they're too powerful. It's scary.
Yeah, and I remember back I think it was in the 80s when they broke up Pacific Bell. I think it was called Pacific Bell back then.
It was AT&T that broke up.
Oh, was it? And they broke it in because it was the only telephone company in the country, right?
Yeah.
And they broke it up into 5 different companies throughout the country. Well, now you got these big conglomerates that control so much vast amounts of information. I mean, Amazon, who needs to go to a store nowadays when all you could have to do is go on the internet, order something, and it'll be delivered to your doorstep that same day, right? It's a convenience, and nobody's complaining about it, but it's still, you're giving so much power to a single entity. It's a scary thought, man. Yeah, and do they have the ability to control our thoughts, influence our decisions? Absolutely. And I think they use that to their advantage. That's, we didn't even really touch on the consumerism angle of mind control, but I think we did a pretty good justice to this topic. And there's certainly a lot more that we could talk about, but I'm gonna go ahead and close it out at this point.
Well, thank you for having me on. And
it's always a pleasure to have you on, man. So your Twitter is at Tom Tulsa. Are you on Facebook too?
I'm on Facebook as Tom Whitmore.
Okay.
And then
that's
my
where
blog.
that's we first
Yeah,
met on
my
Facebook.
blog is tomwhitmoreblog.wordpress.com.
All right, and so we'll figure out another date to do this in a month or two when you get closer to. Don't you have a new paper that you're working on?
I'm working on a paper. It's going slow right now,
Okay.
but it's summertime and things are happening.
Yeah.
So
Right.
I'm trying to stick with my routine and my regimen and my discipline, but I'm feeling too regimented right now.
Well, you got to have a personal life, man, where you do things that you enjoy. Real quick, Scott Brown, another researcher, another investigator, UFO investigator. He says, ask Tom if he would be able to, through the MUFON, through your MUFON connections, could you get access to a case that he investigated in the 90s so that he could get documentation on that? And I think you would have to probably talk to him directly to get more information, wouldn't you?
Yeah, he could. Scott could email me at twhitmore87@gmail.com. That's twhitmore87@gmail.com. I just need whatever information and data he can supply to me so that I can go to MUFON and see what I can find out.
Wow, man, I missed a bunch of these questions. I'm sorry about that for you guys in the chat. I wasn't paying attention to the chat today. I was listening to Tom because it was such a compelling conversation. But Jack Ryan asks, when they name classified projects, the shorter the name, the more serious the project is, question mark. Is it true? Do you know, Tom? I don't know.
I've never heard that.
Yeah.
I've gotten the impression they do it basically on a random, they have a list of 20,000 words and they pick out 2 words and stick them together and,
Oh,
that
see,
kind of thing.
my theory was a little bit less technical than that. I figured some guy writes down a bunch of random words, folds them up, put them in a hat, takes them to the head of the project, or maybe the secretary of the head of the project, that says pick out a name, because they don't make any sense. Artichoke, sign,
Yeah.
judge, or grudge, I should say. All these.
Well, that way, I mean, if you don't know anything about it and you hear the project name, you're not going to think mind control.
Yeah, exactly.
So.
Exactly. Well, they screwed up when they went to MKULTRA, because MKUltra. I mean,
Well, it seeans obvious to us now because we've heard about it for so long. But back then, I mean, if you were just a person on the street and you heard that, it wouldn't mean anything to you.
Yeah. One person says Obama was a type of Manchurian candidate. I'm not so sure about that. If there's any evidence to prove that, I would consider it, but I think he was just, I don't know. But yeah, he's a past president, and who knows? I mean, you could really say anybody is a Manchurian candidate, I guess, if you're going to put that out there.
It's kind of like saying someone is a cautionary tale. You can say that about just about anybody.
Exactly. Yeah. I think I probably missed a bunch of comments or questions from you guys. There wasn't a lot of activity, but yeah, I appreciate everybody who's tuned in and watching. And if you're still here, wow, thank you for hanging out to the bitter end. Okay. And thank you, Tom. Thank you for being here, man. It's good talking to you. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody.